صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, we'll be beginning our program with some verses from the Holy Quran. Please welcome Maryam with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يعلمون ظاهرا من الحياة الدنيا وهم عن الآخرة هم غافلون. أولم يتفكروا في أنفسهم ما خلق الله السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وأجل مسمى وإن كثيرا من الناس بلقاء ربهم لكافرون. أولم يسيروا في الأرض فينظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلهم كانوا أشد منهم قوة وأثاروا الأرض وعمروها أكثر مما عمروها وجاءتهم رسلهم بالبينات فما كان الله ليظلمهم ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. ثم كان عاقبة الذين أساءوا السوء أن كذبوا بآيات الله وكانوا بها يستهزئون. الله يبدأ الخلق ثم يعيده ثم إليه ترجعون. ويوم تقوم الساعة يبلس المجرمون ولم يكن لهم من شركائهم شفعاء وكانوا بشركائهم كافرين. ويوم تقوم الساعة يومئذ يتفرقون. فأما الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فهم في روضة يحبرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Brothers and sisters, we're very fortunate today to be welcoming Dr. Fatima Rajina to discuss her book, British Bangladeshi Muslims in the East End. Please welcome her with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Dr. Fatima Rajina is a senior lecturer in Action Research Fellow at the Stephen Lawrence Research Center at De Montfort University. Her book, British Bangladeshi Muslims in the East End, The Changing Landscape of Dress and Language, was published in July 2024 with Manchester University Press. Please give her another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about some of the core themes of the book. But before I start, I want to say thank you to Miqdad. I know he's not here, but he invited me today, so huge shout out to Miqdad. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, so I'll speak for about maybe 25 minutes, half an hour, just to give you an overview of the entire book. And just talk to you about why dress and language. So I'll start with that, because I usually get that question is, why dress and language? Why didn't you think about food? And I actually wanted to look at dress, language, and food. But when I went to my PhD supervisor, she recommended I stick to 2 themes or 2 variables, because 3 becomes too much and then the thesis would be too superficial and it wouldn't allow for enough room for analysis. So I thought, okay, fine. So I thought, what do I stick with? So I stuck to dress and language. And I stuck to language, which is the first thing I want to start off with, I became interested in how, particularly for the Bangladeshi community, language is quite a significant component of their sort of heritage identity. So I draw upon a lot of different moments in history. So you have partition that happens in 1947. With partition, you had the two-nation theory, which established Pakistan and India. And Pakistan obviously had two wings. It had the eastern wing and the western wing. And in the eastern wing, following partition in August, March of 1948, Muhammad Ali Jinnah came to Dhaka University and he told the students that you can all continue to speak Bangla. Bangla, you know, do whatever you want with Bangla, but the lingua franca of the state will be Urdu. And that, of course, wasn't received particularly well because the eastern wing of Pakistan people didn't speak Urdu. That wasn't the language people spoke, or people read in, or people listened to, or people wrote in. And that then accumulates, and then in 1952, 21st of February, you have the confrontation between students and police who shoot multiple students, and that's when they say the language movement began. And if you look at the United Nations, 21st of February is usually celebrated as the International Mother Language Day, and that's sort of come about because of these particular moments in Bangladesh. And 1952, when these sort of confrontations began, it was about, well, we want Bangla to be included as part of one of the languages of the state, and that Urdu is not the language we speak. And one other thing I found when I started looking into the archive, which I wasn't aware, was that when obviously Jinnah was sort of leading, there were attempts to establish schools across Bangladesh to change the Nagri script, so the Devanagari script of Bangla, into the Urdu script. And that was unsuccessful. And then people wanted it to be recognized as a state language. It wasn't. 1956, it was by then recognized. But there were lots of other tensions. So it wasn't just the cultural element, or rather linguistic. There were cultural struggles where, you know, Bangladeshis were being framed in a particular way as, you know, these are people who are too into the liberal arts. They wear the sari. Which makes them un-Islamic, because the construction of what constitutes being Islamic in the subcontinent was being done through a very particular North Indian lens with a hyper focus on Urdu. So the Bengalis were being stereotyped as, you know, these are people who still wear their saris, they wear their bindis, they love their liberal arts, they love their Tagore. So there was a cultural element there as well, but also economic. And because I don't want it to seem like Bangladesh just fought for liberation based on language only. There were multiple other elements. But I do want to point out I am not a historian. I'm a sociologist, but I use history as a way to narrate these stories, to understand the contemporary. And with the language, I also then became interested in I mean, I put Farsi, but I mean, I don't know, many of you may speak Indo-European languages, which have lots of Farsi words. So before the British made English the sort of official language of administration, you know, Farsi was the term, the language that was used in administration in the Indian subcontinent. You know, I've had friends who've traveled to India who've met very elderly people in Bombay who still speak Farsi. So, and we have terms like namaz, jai namaz, khuda hafiz. So I look and trace some of these words and how they're used, and it's quite incredible. Do you want water? Sorry. Oh, you're no. Do you need? Oh, okay. With Farsi, with these terminologies, I look at how, in the context of East London, how Bangladeshis are using these particular terms. So I look at terms like, you know, khuda hafiz, how is that used, namaz, jai namaz, how these terms come about. And what I found in my data was that the people that I interviewed who had adult children, so anyone over the age of 18, they used these terms, khuda hafiz, namaz, primarily with their parents, but when they spoke to their children, which language do you think they used? Oh, lots of different languages. They used primarily Arabic. So if they spoke to their children, they would say, it's time for Salah. But if they spoke to their parents, they would say, it's time to do our namaz now, get ready, you know, it's time for namaz. And what I found is, so in sort of linguistics, people look at code switching, and they look at code switching amongst sort of ethnic minorities between English and whatever your other heritage language may be. But what I found in my sort of data is that there's a religious code switching happening amongst a lot of Bangladeshis I interviewed. So I just gave you one example of a parent with adult children and then their parents. But what I found amongst sort of under 30s, participants was that, so if they're with other South Asian Muslims, they use the terms namaz, it's time to do namaz, it's time to get the jai namaz out, get ready to pray. But as soon as that circle of their friends or in the masjid included anyone that was non-South Asian, they immediately used Arabic because they felt that Arabic is the lingua franca for Muslims. And it's quite striking because numerically speaking, there are more people in the world who say namaz than they do salah, right? If we look at, Central Asian languages incorporate, namaz. If you go to Turkey, it's namaz. The entire sort of Indian subcontinent is namaz. But it's, again, so I look at these sort of power dynamics between languages, between Muslims, and how language operates in these particular spaces. And how it's also a very generational element of recognizing that those under 30, particularly those born and raised in Britain, although some of the parents I interviewed with adult children did grow up in Britain, but my argument in the book is that because of their proximity to their parents, who still had so much proximity to Bangladesh, that they retained a relationship with their heritage in the way that their children don't. Because with their parents, they can switch to English. When they can't explain something in Bangla, they can switch to English. But when they're communicating with grandparents, that's when they need an intermediary where a parent has to say, well, this is what your grandmother's saying, or this is what your granddad is saying, right? So yeah, so language became quite significant for me, but also the other element about language is the Bengali community across Britain, there used to be supplementary schools, Saturday, Sunday schools, where if it was 90 minutes, let's say, 45 minutes was to learn Bangla. So you had to learn the vowels at the top there, then you had to learn the consonants, and then you had to learn how to conjugate them and how to make sentences and so on and so forth. And the remainder of the 45 minutes was then about learning tajweed, learning Arabic, how to recite, how to memorize your du'as. And then actually with the Bangla section, you also had to learn a lot of poetry. So I don't know if anyone here knows any Bangla, knows any of the Bengali poems, but you had to learn them. So if you ask a generation of young people who went to these supplementary schools, which were called Bangla Fora. Fora means reading. So if you went to Bangla Fora schools, a lot of people still remember those poems. A lot of these poems are about, very sort of folk poems about the village, about the landscape, about the land, and lots of nostalgia in a lot of these poems. So I look at these transitions from supplementary schools to sort of use of language and the sort of and I look at some of the political tensions. I look at the fact that, how many of you have heard the shift from Khuda Hafiz to Allah Hafiz? Right? How many of you use Khuda Hafiz or hear people using Khuda Hafiz? Okay. What about Allah Hafiz? Okay, this is interesting. Okay. Sorry? Yes, because that's to do with the politics of the 80s in Pakistan. Because of Zia's Islamization of Pakistan and sort of banning of the sari. This is where you have the famous performance by Iqbal Bano, where she wears that black sari, she gives, performs Hum Dekhenge, and and it's received, by a fairly large audience. It was supposed to be a private event, but someone filmed it and then made it public. So looking at that particular period and how that shifted some of these language relationships for other communities. So not just in Pakistan for Punjabis and Sindhis and, Balochis, but it really resonated and had an impact, sort of like a domino effect, if you want to say, on other Muslim communities across the Indian subcontinent. So those are things that I look at for the language and the relationship. And the other particular element I have to address here is that the majority of Bangladeshis, over 90%, are from the northeastern region of Sylhet. and they speak Sylheti, so they don't speak standard Bangla, which you hear in the news, the newspapers, the dramas. So Sylheti speaks Sylheti, it is its own language, but it doesn't have a written script anymore. So a lot of it is just still very verbal, it's an oral language. And I look at some of these tensions of, although if you go to Tower Hamlets, it still has lots of newspapers that are locally printed by the Bangla press in Bangla. And I look at some of this and how that shifted with, well, who's picking up these newspapers to read them? And because I was just telling actually Mariam just before we started that there's a growing population of Italian Bangladeshis now in the UK generally, but also in the East End. And they are also helping sort of revive the sort of publication and reading of the newspapers, whereas the younger crowd obviously can't speak Bangla or read Bangla. Very few schools still offer GCSE Bangla in Tower Hamlets. And it's interesting because when you go to Whitechapel, they changed the tube station name and have it in Bangla. And I think it's rather ironic because if you get, I don't know, a 21-year-old to stand there and break down the letters, they won't be able to. They just know it says Whitechapel because the English is there, but they won't be able to break it down and sort of, showcase that they know and have an actual, grasp of the language. So yeah, so that's what I look at when it comes to language and the relationship and the religious element. What was quite striking was the way people had this relationship with Arabic and how they felt that, for example, out of my 43 participants, only 2 spoke Arabic. 2 of them lived in, one lived in Syria, the other had studied and lived in Egypt. So they spoke modern standard Arabic as well as the sort of particular dialects from Syria and Egypt. And one of them said to me, I speak to my kids in Arabic. So I said to him, so is your wife Arab? And he said, no, my wife is Bengali. So I said, oh, okay, so what made you decide to speak Arabic to your children? And he said, well, I don't think, Sylheti is a particularly useful language for them to know. Now, and he said he felt that they need to know Arabic. And what was quite striking when I looked at more of my data was that people have a very, it's almost like the Christian notion of salvation is attached to the Arabic language of, well, when I'm buried, when I'm being questioned, it will be done in Arabic, so I need to know Arabic. And I do want to emphasize I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist, because I end up getting lots of questions about the theology. I am not a theologian, but these are the things that people were sharing that I then address from a sociological perspective of what that means. And yeah, he just said, yeah, I want my kids to basically know Arabic as a language of Allah. And I critique some of that in the book, and I talk about the fact that, that was what was happening in the Indian subcontinent, the sort of idea that if you have the Arabic script, as part, and this is why Urdu was then hailed as sort of the language of the Muslims. And even today, that whole battle you hear of Urdu versus Hindi, and their foundational sort of grammar is the same, So it's just really interesting, right? Because a lot of it is infused by religious and political sort of ideologies, and then that then makes people think if you say dua instead of prarthna, it means that you're advocating for Urdu than you are for Hindi. So a lot of language is infused by politics, by how it's positioned, and in the Indian subcontinent, Islam has been represented historically primarily through Urdu, and of course it's wild because if you look at the Indian subcontinent, it's made up of so many different ethnic groups who speak these hugely sort of different languages with different tree branches. When you go to south of India, those languages, the way gender works doesn't work the same way in the Indo-European languages. So yeah, sorry, I have a background in linguistics. My undergraduate degree was in German and Spanish, so I always found etymology and philology fascinating, but that is not my book. One other thing before I move on to the next thing is, so the other thing that came up in my data was how a lot of Bangladeshis became conscious of how non-Sylheti saw them and why they felt conscious of speaking Sylheti. So just to give you an example, it's a bit like how in the British context, particularly within the Pakistani context, you see the tensions between Mirpuris and primarily Punjabis, where there's a sort of perception of Mirpuris are, you know, sort of from the village, backward. There are particular perceptions. And that sort of translates in a similar fashion in the Bangladeshi community, where Silatis are seen as more peasant people. They're from the villages, they have agricultural backgrounds, their parents were usually, or their forefathers were people who worked on the rice fields, or they were fishmongers. So there are these tensions that I look at, and how that then again plays out through language, which is infused through these sort of, I guess, ethnic, well, they're not different ethnic groups, but or regional would be the better term, actually. So regional tensions between language and perception of class, and to an extent caste as well. But I'm going to move on to language, to dress. And dress is where I feel my book is the juiciest. Because, so I look at 4 particular items for dress, particularly for heritage identity. I look at the sari, or shari in Bangla. I look at the shalwar kameez. I look at the longi and the Punjabi. So I'm going to talk through these 4 items and why I look at those and what that means. That picture there of modern sari centre, I took that in 2014. It was the last standing sari shop on Brick Lane, which closed that year. And then it became a cafe, which has now closed down. But yeah, if you, I mean, I don't know if any of you have relatives who wear saris or you wear saris, but who remembers those mannequins with their big little, you know, those big humpy style buns? So yeah, those were really popular back in the day. And saris, if you look at the archive and you look at Bangladeshi women in the East End or in other parts of the country, they were almost always in saris. And what is interesting about the sari for the Bangladeshi community as well is that it is a marker of womanhood. So the shalwar kameez was a marker of girlhood. It meant that usually you were single, so aunties could come out with rishtahs to your family and, you know, try and figure out who your dad is, who to approach. And then you transitioned into the sari as a sort of, because you became a woman, you know. That was usually as part of sort of marriage. And in sort of traditional Bangladeshi weddings, you gave the bride 7 saris as part of her bridal collection, well, not collection, but as part of a sort of giving her away as part of her, if you want to say, portfolio of saris. And one of the saris was always either white or off-white or cream tone. And that was usually to do namaz. That was for prayers. So these 7 saris were supposed to depict different sort of points for her for when she goes as a newlywed, when she goes to different davats or family invites, when she's praying. So you know, so it's a part of the culture ingrained. But what I found is that saris are not usually what's gifted anymore, or as part of the bride's giveaway. It consists of when it comes to the religious element, it's usually it's almost like, I don't know what they call it in Indonesia, but you know how in Indonesia they wear those long, it's almost like onesies. Right, no offense, I just feel like it looks like a onesie sometimes. So it's a onesie sometimes that's included, or like a jilbab that's included. So it's no longer the sari. So I look at some of that change in relationship with the sari, and some of that was also influenced by, I'm not going to lie, when I found these pictures, I remembered I'm in a masjid. So if you want me to go past these, I'll happily do that. But I do want to address the influence of Bollywood and how Bollywood has influenced people's and changed people's relationship with the sari. Because the famous chiffon sari of Bollywood is, you know, what people have grown up watching and seeing, and it's supposed to entice the male protagonist. And a lot of my female participants spoke about how, you know, actually, my male participants, when they spoke about the sari, they classified it as immodest. It doesn't cover the body. it doesn't meet the requirements, Islamic boundaries of modesty. Now, when I spoke to the women, it was interesting because the women were saying, oh, well, it's not very practical, it keeps falling off, the weather's not appropriate. So do you see the difference in responses? So I analyze both streams, and I look at, for women, it was weather, the practicality element. They felt the shalwar kameez was more practical and met the requirements of modesty, whereas the sari didn't. And this is where I draw on the work on Professor Rachel Dwyer, who was a professor of South Asian Studies at SOAS, and she actually looks at the sari and how the sari has now, in people's broader imagination or political imagination of India, is associated with Hindus. And again, this is incorrect because there are many Muslims in the Indian subcontinent who wear the sari. Some still wear it as part of their everyday wear for their, weddings, events. So I look at the politicization of the sari as well, and how it's come to be associated with particular religious groups. But it's really, but when you look at the history of the sari, it is worn in different ways, even from different regions. It can be draped in over sort of 100 different styles. So if you go to the Gujarat, it's usually styled to the front. You usually bring the achal or the pallu to the front. If you're Parsi, it's worn very similarly to Gujaratis, but bought just below your knees. If you're Bengali, it's usually worn, you don't pleat, a Bengali sari style, you don't pleat at the front. So I guess my point here is that it became flattened to just this idea of it being immodest and cannot meet the requirements of modesty. And of course, those of you who may be familiar with draping saris, you would know that actually that's down to personal preference of how the length of your blouse's sleeves and the length downward. So it really is about your also personal relationship with the boundaries around modesty. Now, the shalwar kameez became quite that was received in more positive terms, if you want to say, by the male and female participants. Because with the shalwar kameez, what came up was it meets the requirement of modesty. Now, again, with shalwar kameez, it really depends on the style you go for. I mean, you can have it cut and wear, those capri trousers, that show a significant amount of your legs, lower end of your legs. So, but there was a general consensus amongst my participants that the shalwar kameez is modest. And I look at school uniform policy, actually, and I incorporate that. And I look at how lots of schools in Tower Hamlets had the shalwar kameez, and still do in some of the schools as part of their school uniform policy. And this is where I came across the famous case of Shabina Begum in Luton from Denby High School in 2004 and 5, where she one day turned up to school. So at her school, their uniform is navy blue. You had to wear navy blue trousers, white shirt, navy blue and white striped tie, and navy blue blazer or jumper, and or cardigan. And she turns up one day wearing a jilbab. So the jilbab is just a long sort of dress with a hijab. And she turns up with 2 male relatives. And obviously the head teacher comes out and says, well, we can't let you into the school because this is not school uniform policy. And the 2 male relatives say to the head teacher, well, otherwise, you'll be denying, her education if you don't let her in. And it turned into a legal battle. She ended up being represented by Sherry Blair, by Tony Blair's wife, and she lost the case. But it was an interesting moment in sort of looking at shalwar kameez history in Britain, because I look at some of the legal documents and how the conversations take place. And the school goes to Regent's Park Mosque and tells them, look, we've got this issue where we have a young pupil who doesn't believe that the shalwar kameez meets the requirement. What do we do here? And a lot of the sort of, the ulama or the sheikhs came together and said, actually, lots of different garments across the world meet the requirements, and the shalwar kameez is one of them. And then when that was taken back by the head teacher and the school as part of their case, this then happened where her side of the argument was, well, the shalwar kameez is part of Pakistani culture and it's worn by Hindus and Sikhs, therefore not being Islamic. Which is also quite striking because shalwar kameez historically in the Indian subcontinent has only ever been associated with Muslims. Now that shifted in the late 80s, in the 90s, when India started its neoliberal sort of policies, opening of the market. The modern Indian woman was presented through the shalwar kameez or through the kurtas and the jeans, who was working in the up-and-coming offices that were popping up in the metropolitan, cosmopolitan cities. And the shalwar kameez was, this is where I draw on the work of Emma Tarlow, who looks at clothing and textiles and history of clothing, and she's at Goldsmiths, and she finds in her work on India that, so she interviews this Brahmin priest, so an upper caste Brahmin priest, and he sort of says, I'm not happy that my daughter has to wear a shalwar kameez because that's what they wear, referencing Muslims. That's what they wear. I don't want my daughter to look like them. But he also then contended with the fact that the modern Indian woman was being constructed through the shalwar kameez. So therefore he accepted it. And this is where I draw on the history of stitched material and unstitched material, because for a lot of upper caste Hindus in particular, wearing unstitched clothing was a part of sort of the purity, hence why Gandhi eventually, when he took up the wearing of the dhoti, which wasn't stitched. So there's a lot of history of stitched and unstitched with purity and impurity, so I go into that as well. But coming back to the British context, I look at this case study to look at how there's constantly been this battle of religion versus culture, and these two things have never in human history existed as independent entities ever. They've always intermingled. You can't say the shalwar kameez is a part of a particular culture, therefore not Islamic. This tension came up amongst my participants as well, where, this behavior is not Islamic. So one particular behavior that people were using as an example was, this doesn't happen often anymore, but a lot of Bangladeshis, when they would greet their elders, they used to touch the feet of their elders. And that sort of became, it's pretty much unseen. It's so rare. If you see it, you'll be a bit taken aback to see that someone is touching their elders' feet. And the argument used was that, we don't bow in front of anyone other than Allah. And again, I critique some of that because I thought, well, first of all, that isn't sujood. You're touching your elder's feet. You're not going down. Your forehead isn't touching. I know that, for example, for some Hindus, they do have their foreheads touch their elders' feet. But a lot of Muslims, they didn't do that in Bangladesh. They just touched the elders' feet and sort of then stood up. So I look at some of these sort of tensions between culture versus religion because a lot of my participants had these very clear black and white idea of culture is this, and we don't mix that with religion, which then brings forward the critique of, which comes out later in my work when I look at the thobe in particular, because a lot of the men that spoke about the thobe almost spoke about the thobe as if it just sort of landed and it has no culture. And of course, that's an outrageous statement, right? Because the thobe has a history and has a different kind of stitching pattern. If you buy one from Syria, it's so different to one in Morocco, to ones from Saudi. Moroccan ones also have like a hoodie attached to them if you buy one of those with a hoodie. So it's interesting how this idea of this Islamic identity can be within this sort of pure entity and have no influence of culture. And what that does, it actually then flattens Arab culture by making it seem like it doesn't have its own culture. And obviously, if you're Arab and you hear that, that's pretty offensive because each region, not just country, region has different histories, just like we do in the Indian subcontinent. So this is where I'm going to quickly address the Longi and the Punjabi. So the Longi is I guess to use within the English language phrasing, it's like a skirt-like garment. You sort of wrap it up around your navel area and then you tuck it in. It's also worn in other parts of the Indian subcontinent. It's worn in Southeast Asia as well. And but the Longi was quite interesting. So because when I spoke to my participants and I asked them, when you're doing sociological ethnographic work, you have to keep your questions fairly open-ended. You let the participant sort of guide you, and that's where of course I go in with my hypotheses about what I want to sort of analyze and find out. But through your data, you realize, okay, well, the participants have come up with this, this, this. So one of the things that was quite striking was when I spoke to the male participants and I asked them, I'm paraphrasing the question here, is how important do you think is faith and dress, faith, identity, and dress? And how do you think my male participants responded to that question? Thank you. They almost immediately started speaking about their wives, their sisters, their daughters, their mothers, saying, well, my wife chose to wear the hijab. I never made her do anything. My mother. And then when they finished, I would say, actually, I mean for you. What does faith, identity, and clothing mean to you? And some of them got a little bit awkward because no one ever asks men why they wear what they wear. Right? It's always because, and also within academia, academic literature has been oversaturated with that may be my husband if he's got a big beard, because I think he's lost. Is it? That's my husband then, yes. He doesn't know which way to come in. Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Sorry, where was I? Oh, yes, you're all listening. Wonderful. And they just got really awkward, and they just felt like, oh, no one's ever asked me this. Why are you interested? I said, because I want to know what men wear. I want to know why you choose what you choose to wear, and when do you choose to wear what you wear. And then obviously when I asked the question about the longi, it got even more awkward because they were sort of straighten up, straighten their backs, fix their ties, because the longi is worn a bit like the kilt. You don't wear undergarments with the longi, so a lot of them got very uncomfortable. And with the longi, in the British context, it's very much a domesticated garment, so it's in the domestic space it's worn. There's one charity in Tower Hamlets where they do run in the longi to raise funds for charity. And again, I critique some of that around how it's turned into a gimmick, and what that says about people's relationship, particularly men's relationship with the longi. And one of my participants, who throughout the interview kept making football references, said to me, do you remember that time David Beckham wore that sarong and it was plastered on every newspaper? I said, yeah, I remember. And he said, well, why would I do that to myself in Tower Hamlets? So I then theorize and analyze some of this through sort of perceptions of masculinity, of seeing it as a skirt, which it isn't, right? Because if you go to Bangladesh and tell someone, well, you're wearing a skirt, they would just look at you and think you're being a bit off, like, why are you calling it a skirt? So I look at how so much of sort of the Western paradigm has then shifted people's relationship to their ethnic garments, and the longi then being treated as a skirt, even though it is not a skirt, and it's not worn by women, if we want to look at it from that gendered perspective. Now, in Bangladesh, though, the longi is a very working class garment. So it's usually worn by rickshaw pullers, by the men who pull the cartwheels with the fruit and vegetables, the men who drive the tuk-tuks, or the CNGs, as they're called in Bangladesh. Now, with the Punjabi, which is the kurta or pajama or Punjabi, depending on the language. So the Punjabi is, the Punjabi had a more, I could say, flexible relationship within my participants, because they felt like, yeah, I'll wear the Punjabi, I'll wear it for Eid, I'll wear it for a wedding or Mendi. But there was a conversation about color that came up. And the men who had adult children said that they and their sons would never wear the bright pinks and the mustards and the pinks and the greens and whatever, because they felt like, oh, again, masculinity of, well, I'm not going to go out in a lime green Punjabi, But those parents, when they spoke about their parents, they thought, oh, they don't care about colors. They'll wear it because that's what they want to wear. So they'll wear the bright purple and the yellows and the oranges, and they're not so bound by these ideas of and boundaries around colors, because their relationship with colors and wearing of colors is very different to their children and their children's children, because they see color in a very feminized form. And this is why when I started paying attention to how people dress for Jummah, they usually wear lots of, what I call the standard British colors of navy, blue, gray, black, the dark tones, the sort of tone that almost sort of, where you just sort of mesh into everyone else, into the crowd, right? So color became an element that I ended up having to look at, which I didn't think of, but my participants were saying, yeah, no way would I be seen in a hot pink Punjabi, but my dad would be okay with that. And one of the ways that I look at that, and I look at why Tower Hamlets becomes this place that is so comfortable for so many Bangladeshis, is that I don't know if anyone here knows Dr. Shabna Begum's work. She's currently the CEO of Runnymede Trust. She did her PhD looking at the squatters movement, how a lot of Bangladeshi families had to squat in the 70s to get the houses that they live in today. And in that, she argues that if you look at the way a Bangladeshi village is made up, so the term that Bengalis use is bari, but bari usually means, it's a bit like the term pind, right? When you use the word pind, it connotes different things, that there are different things going on, right? So the bari in Bangladesh is almost like a clan-like system, rectangular or square form. So you'll have a house, and that house will usually have a rooftop where people dry their clothes, their fruits, and for Bengalis, they also dry and ferment their fish. Then you have the courtyard, and depending on the wealth of your family, you'll have an area designated for your bulls, for your cows, for your goats. Then you'll have the back of your house, you will have a pond, and usually that's where you take your dips, you wash your dishes, and then again, depending on your wealth, you may have a piece of land for your rice field, and then a fishery. And what she argues is that this is then referred to as the neighborhood, as the para. In Sylheti, it's fara. So Sylhetis tend to drop the P's. So if you say pani, Sylhetis will say fani. So Sylhetis call it the fara. And what Shabna argues in her book is that for a lot of Bengalis in Tower Hamlets, and a particular generation who arrived in the sort of 60s, 70s, is that for them, there is that sort of boundary between domestic or public and the private isn't so sort of black and white. So when they step out of their homes, they see broader Tower Hamlets as part of the domestic space. It's still a part of the fara. It's a part of the para that actually, so that's why you have these men who are in their late 60s, early 70s, have no qualms turning up to East London Mosque in a longi and doing their Jummah in their longi, because they don't constitute Tower Hamlets in that way. Now, when I look at some of the men and women I interviewed below the age of 30, they look at Tower Hamlets in a similar way as their fara, but that fara and the boundaries of the fara are informed through the Western paradigm of questions around masculinity, around my peers, around the fact that, my peers include Muslims of other backgrounds. So if I turn up in a longi, those Muslims will also take the mickey out of me and say, ha, 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 right? So I look at that, and I look at how geography plays a part in how people leave their homes and are willing to leave their homes wearing what they wear. Now, so the longi, these are just some articles of how classed it is in Bangladesh, because over a decade ago, in 3 parts of Dhaka, Gulshan, Bonani, and I always forget the third area, these are downtown Dhaka these areas are very, very bougie. This is where you have the fancy cafes, the embassies, everyone's usually speaking English in those areas. They've officially banned the longi in these 3 areas. Well, it was at the time, and the only people you will see in these areas in a longi are, again, the rickshaw pullers who drop you off. That's assuming people from those areas would even take a rickshaw. So the longi in Bangladesh is very classed, and what I found through some research I looked at from, what are they called? Oh my God! Oh yeah. When I looked at the work of Khan and Sharma, what they found was middle-class people in Bangladesh, as part of their zakat, will give the longi as part of their zakat to the poor, while they themselves are wearing the Punjabi. So I look at that, and as you can see from the quote here, that the Punjabi, the broader dominant framing of the Muslim, is not the imagined garb for Muslims. It is still not seen as an Islamic garment, though. I want to emphasize that. None of my participants saw the Punjabi as an Islamic garment, even though a lot of Bangladeshi imams in Bangladesh will likely wear a Punjabi, along with a longi or trousers, and lead the prayers. So yeah, but amongst my participants in Britain, it was not seen as an Islamic garment. It was still seen representing heritage, your ethnic background. So they had a very clear delineation between ethnicity and religion. Now, going back to this was a picture from an interfaith meeting that happened with Professor Yunus just over 2 weeks ago. And Farhad Mazhar, who is speaking there, is a philosopher. And he was the only person who turned up in a longi. Because in Bangladesh's history, not a single male head of state or senior politician has ever been seen in public wearing the longi. Even with Professor Yunus, if you look at pictures of him, he's usually wearing the Nehru jacket, you know, the waistcoat, with like a kurta and trousers. So again, there's something to be said about the fact that the longi is very classed, and even during the uprisings, the student uprisings in July and August, if you look at the illustration there, the illustration captures the rickshaw driver who was in a longi, who was taking a young man to the hospital who was shot by the police. So when you look at images of the revolution just from this summer, the rickshaw pullers then suddenly came through, and they were taking all the young people and people who were being shot at to hospitals in their rickshaws. And even there you see the class dynamic of who is being pulled onto the rickshaw. It's quite a graphic image. That's why I didn't want to include the image, and I included the illustration. And he was then carried. He sadly passed away because the police didn't let them get to the hospital on time. But coming back to the religion versus culture, we see it playing out in other ways in the Indian subcontinent, and this is where I'm going to draw on Shah Rukh Khan's character of Devdas, because he plays a Bengali Brahmin character. He's Devdas Mukherjee, you know, upper caste Bengali Brahmin, and is set during the British Raj. And if you look at, for example, how Shah Rukh Khan has his dhoti draped, that if you see that today in Bangladesh or even in West Bengal in India, you will almost sort of exclusively assume this is a Hindu uncle. Even though historically this style was also worn by the Nawabs, Bengali Nawabs, who wore also dhoti style. But because it all became so clearly confined to particular expressions that it no longer, you know, if you see the style, you will almost assume, so in Bangla you call a Hindu Bengali uncle Dada, you know, you would just say, oh, that's a Dada walking down the road. Whereas if you wear the Punjabi with a longi, where it doesn't show your legs, so if you look at the middle image, you can see your legs. With the longi, you can't see the legs because it's skirt-like. And that's when you know they are likely to be Muslim, but also it could be that they are just a lower class, lower caste Bengali Muslim or Hindu. So again, so much of the way we see dress and clothing is classed, is caste, and it's also confined through religion and the way it's then understood and consumed. I'm just going to finish up now with reference to Gandhi and Maulana Bashani. Has anyone here ever heard of Maulana Bashani? No? Well, you have today, so go away, read about him. So Maulana Bashani is also known as the Lal Maulana. He led farmers and peasant workers in Bangladesh, and he was one of the only few public figures. In fact, he was the only public figure who wore the longi. So if you look at, so one of the leading scholars who looks at Maulana Bashani's politics and the way he galvanized and mobilized peasant workers and farmers is Dr. Laili Uddin, who is at Queen Mary, and she looks at how he mobilized people and brought people together, and through a particular form of Islamic socialism, which is quite prevalent. Even with the recent revolution, a lot of the students come from this particular tradition of Islamic socialism, and this is very much the sort of history that Maulana Bashani comes from and comes through. Now, with Gandhi, I already mentioned the sort of stitched and unstitched, but also how, I just want to give you an example from the colonial period where even with the sari. So when the British arrived in India, they found Indians, and I'm using Indians broadly here from sort of during colonialism. They found Indians naked people. They were too naked for the British sensibilities. So I cite this passage from a colonial officer's diary, which I found in Professor Bernard Cohen's work, looking at knowledge production in British colonial India. And when this colonial officer arrives in India, and he has this young Indian sort of servant who is helping him with his baggages and whatnot, and he writes in his diary, when I met this Indian servant or man helping me, I thought his skin, because it was shimmering so much, I thought it was clothing, because the British had never come across sort of dark skin or skin tones that were darker than I guess pale skin, and he wrote in his diary entry he thought it was clothing, it was a layer of clothing. It's really interesting because obviously when we look at the history of race and racism, there has been this idea of the sort of darker your skin, the more layers you have, and therefore you have a higher threshold for pain, which is obviously absurd. That is not true. But yeah, so sort of these understanding of skin tone and skin all comes out. And again, that's not what I look at for my book, but I look at how clothing and then skin comes about. And obviously with the unstitched clothing as well, you know, because it was seen as, you know, it just sort of lands on your skin. It's not fitted onto your skin, right? Because if you drape the sari, it's just a form of drape and then you just put it over, right? Whereas wearing of a shalwar kameez, which I'm wearing right now, or a shirt, or you know your coat, these are fitted, right? Whereas the sari isn't. So yeah, so there were lots of debates around that. But one other element, I do look at dress and looking at religious identity through the thobe. I look at the beard. I look at the hijab, jilbab, and niqab. I have to admit, this was not what I was remotely interested in, because I don't think you have to be an academic to even take a guess at the fact that there's been an obsession with Muslim women. The literature and academia is oversaturated with Muslim women and hijab, Muslim women and niqabs. And if I'm very honest, I'm not interested in any of those things, because you know, it always comes from a particular lens and framing, and it just never sat well with me. But I felt as part of this to look at how, you know, sort of post 9/11, post 7/7, there is a more prevalence of these garments. So for me, I became interested in, okay, so you are wearing these garments. It's a sort of given fact. We see this in our everyday, getting on the tube, bus, driving, shopping, whatever we're doing. But I became interested in what became absent, and obviously the sari became absent. The shalwar kameez is becoming absent. The longi, the Punjabi. So that's how I came to those garments, by recognizing that these have become so visible, what had to be invisibilized for these to become visible. So yeah, so I don't think my data is providing anything new about Muslim women, surprise, surprise. It's very much complements most of the work out there, or sometimes, I mean, I think some of my analysis is slightly more rigorous, because some of the work I've seen is quite just outrageous that some of these things get published about Muslim women. It seems like it became the entry point for a lot of people to get their research out there, and Muslim women's body just became that avenue through which many people did. But the one thing that I do that is quite original is that looking at men and clothes, because how often do you come across work that looks at Muslim men and clothes? So I obviously became fascinated with looking at men's relationship with the thobe, their framing of the thobe, and the colors as well, because they brought up the colors, because they're okay to wear pastel colors with the thobe. Because if you go to thobe shops, or just generic sort of Islamic shops, thobes usually come in sort of pastel colors, like the baby blues and the sort of beige tones and cream tones, and men were accepting of those colors, and I thought that was quite interesting, even though if we want to look at color palettes and feminizing, you know, pastel colors can be seen as such. So yeah, so again, I look at these and I critique it, but I do have an exhibition on right now called Jummah Aesthetics at Oxford House in Bethnal Green. I look at, this whole project is about what Muslim men wear to Jummah. So it's not just about Bangladeshi men, it's about broadly Muslim men. And I look at 4 masjids. I look at East London Mosque, Brick Lane Mosque, Shoreditch Mosque, and Al Huda. So 4 mosques in the sort of Spitalfields area of Tower Hamlets. And some of these pictures are stunning. You know, they're beautiful and the interviews we captured with the men was also quite striking, because so many of them, the first thing they said was, no one's ever asked me why I wear what I wear. No one's ever inquired about why I wear this or why I don't wear this. And so many spoke so passionately about how they get their kurtas tailored and the fabrics they enjoy. You know, there were some individuals we photographed who also smelt beautiful. They wore, ouds that were, just beautiful. Sadly, it's not a 5D exhibition yet, but if I expand it, I'd love for people to have just a little bit of the bottle there sort of below everyone's image, just so you can smell how they smell in the moment we captured them, because so many of these men really make an effort for Jummah and what Jummah means to them. And the whole exhibition then became about spirituality, men, and the relationship they have with clothing and how they want to present themselves in front of Allah, because a lot of them spoke about the fact that, if I can make the effort to turn up to my corporate job and my 3-piece suits, then why can't I do it for Allah and make the effort and smell good for Him and, make sure my nails are cut, make sure I'm prepared and in the right mindset to read Surah Al-Kahf. So really, it was, of course I'm biased, it's my exhibition, but go and have a look at the photographs we captured and the amazing stories they shared. But I want to end it on that and just say that the book is on Manchester University Press's website. I have physical copies with me today. The book itself is £85. However, the physical books that I have are 50% off if you were interested, so it would be £42.50. However, if you want to order it directly from the University Press's website, if you use the code EVENT30, you get 30% off. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I know I went over the half-an-hour mark, but thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. We have some time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rajina, for your really interesting lecture. And just starting with the Jummah aesthetics, I particularly like the chap who styled his thobe with Gucci accessories.
Oh, yeah.
So that was very interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah. How much do you think migration and globalization are drivers for change, for language, and for clothing? Migration, because it then leads to people living in a multicultural society and then influences what their original thinking is around clothing. And of course, globalization, people's origins, the change that happens in, like, the countries of origin, like, for example, what you described was happening in Bangladesh around the wearing of the thobe, the wearing of the lungi. So those, to my mind, are drivers not specifically just for the Bangladeshi community, but for all of us who might have migrated from wherever we've come from.
Are we doing one question at a time, or? Yeah? Okay, let's do that. Thank you for the question, thank you. I think migration definitely plays a part, and I think wherever you migrate, what happens is, so I use some of the work by Gerd Baumann, who looks at Southall. And when he studies Southall, he looks at 5 communities in Southall. When he's studying Southall, he talks about how you have a political dominant narrative that shapes people's relationship, but then within the area of Southall, people are developing their own sort of discourse as well. So that he calls it the local discourse, he calls the demotic discourse that's taking place, and then the political dominant narrative that we're all being exposed to through media, through messaging, through reels, through social media, through conversations, is what he calls a dominant discourse. And what you have is that amongst Muslims, we have a similar thing. So irrespective of whatever your background is, particularly if you're from the Indian subcontinent, because a lot of my work draws on obviously looking at the Indian subcontinent through the focus on Bangladeshis, is that the dominant narrative in Britain around Muslims has obviously been heavily informed by the war on terror, post 9/11, post 7/7, particular depictions of Muslim men of being sort of, the violent, aggressive, the terrorist, and the Muslim woman has then been framed as the oppressed, the marginalized. But within the Muslim community, what we've seen through this local discourse within our community is that we pushed back against some of that by then employing the very stigma that is being sort of mapped onto our communities as a way to then push back. So that's how I read, for example, the sort of desire to wear the thobe, the desire to be so visibly Muslim in the way that my participants see as Islamic, even though this Islamicness has been expressed in different ways in other parts of the world. And people have always asked me whenever I've done this sort of book talk about the influence of the Gulf on Bangladeshi migrants who go back to Bangladesh, and does that influence the way they dress in Bangladesh? And another friend of mine who is from the Elam Tamil area of Sri Lanka said, whenever he goes back there, he notices how some of the Muslim workers who were in the Gulf have brought back, for example, was it date trees he mentioned when we were speaking? Yeah, that they brought back and have planted date trees now. And they wear the thobe on the streets of Colombo and other parts of Sri Lanka. So I think what happens is you have within the Muslim world, the dominant narrative is shaped so much by what we call the Middle East or West Asia, right? So much of that is then seen as the Islamic culture, and that then sort of trickles down into our then Muslim demotic discourse, which we then employ as a way to fight back against the dominant, saying that, well, you think the thobe is what makes us a terrorist, well, we're going to wear it more, So I think with migration, wherever you land, you end up realizing that there is a dominant culture you have to work with, whichever locality you find yourself in, you work through that discourse to address the dominant. Am I making sense? Yeah. So I think migration, wherever you go. So for example, even if you migrate to the US is an interesting case study. When you look at Muslims in New York, it does not play out in the same way that it does for British Muslims, let's say in London, if you want to compare two major cities. In the New York context, or even Los Angeles, where I've done research, so I've done research on Bengalis in Los Angeles, where there's a big community next to Koreatown called Little Bangladesh, is that the discourse they are managing over there, because the dominant discourse of the Muslim is primarily in people's imagination through the Arab, right? The Arab is the terrorist, the Arab is the that. So what Bangladeshis do in the local discourse is they employ an Indian identity, because the Indian identity carries positive stereotypes in broader American society. They're good at spelling bees, they're good at maths, they're good at this, they're good at that, they're trusted more. And they would be trusted more than the Mexican. So what we found in our data in this research was that Bangladeshis recognized immediately, and this, imagine you're coming from Bangladesh, but this is not the discourse at all. It's a completely different discourse you're managing, dealing with through caste, class. You land in Los Angeles, and within a few months you realize being Indian is what's going to get me the work, because I'll be trustworthy. And plus, a lot of my participants mentioned, well, generally average Americans don't know what Bangladesh is or where it is. So they rely on the Indian identity, but more, not because of the ignorance, but more because of their positive stereotyping of Indians. So migration is one of those things where when you get to an area, you try to figure out the landscape, right? Through hearsay, through friends, through, media, you observe, you learn, it's what we call in academia the discursive. You're learning through the messaging you're receiving in society, whether it's on the bus, your phone, or wherever. And through that, you project yourself to the world with what you deem will be acceptable in that locality. And that's why I speak about geography and location for Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets, because if I compared Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets to, I don't know, I'm from Luton, if I compared them to Luton, that dynamic will not exist because Bangladeshis are a minority within the Luton South Asian context, for example. However, if I compared it to Manchester, Oldham, where the Bengali area is called the Bangla Para, it would probably have some similarities. So it's, again, all about if you find yourself in a group where you're the dominant group, even within a locality, and how that then pans out. But if you're not, then you will make sure you live up to whatever the status quo dominant narrative is of how you ought to be. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, yes, that's excellent. I think one of the other things, perhaps even superficially, is that, for example, choice of colour is driven by the need to fit in, if you like, in inverted commas, so people will go for muted tones because, I'll give you a personal story. When I was 13, I visited a relative from East Africa. I came to England for a holiday and visited him, and I wore my very best white trousers and what we call in East Africa kitenge, which is a very brightly printed shirt. And I thought I looked the bee's knees, and he looked at me in horror and immediately required me to change because I didn't fit in. I just looked very odd in the British context.
Yeah, muted colours were very popular amongst my participants, and I do draw on the fact that it's because that's the broad dominant narrative that's shaping their relationship to colours. Because, you know, I mean, if I turned up to one of my lectures in let's say, a yellow sari, I know I'll be received differently to me turning up, you know, even in a muted sari with like a jumper or something, you know, as an example. Because, you know, the way we consume colours, obviously when you come from the Indian subcontinent, colours usually, you know, in different communities, colours mean different things. You know, for some South Asian ethnic groups, you wear, well, even if you're Muslim, you wear white to funerals, for example. You would never get married in white, for example. So I think, I look at these relationships and how colours mean different things in different communities in the Indian subcontinent, but in the British context, it then retranslates as whatever the dominant narrative is, and that's muted colours is what you wear, and you do not stand out. And if you try to stand out, then obviously you're disciplined, right? And that disciplining happens through why you defying the dominant way of being. So yeah.
Any questions from the ladies' side? Do you want to go?
Hi. When you did your research in Alhamdulillah or wherever, were there any non-Muslim Bengalis? And did the non-Muslims dress code or language, or was it different from the Muslim ones?
Well, my book only focuses on British Bangladeshi Muslims, although there is a small community of Bangladeshi Hindus in Tower Hamlets and Newham. So, for example, during Durga Puja season, you will see a lot of, community centres being filled up for Durga Puja celebrations. There's a very small Bangladeshi Christian community, primarily Catholic, and some Buddhists. But I've not interviewed them because I solely focus on the Bangladeshi Muslim community. Any from the women? Oh, okay.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. When you spoke to both female and male participants, and you mentioned a lot of the men, when you asked about dress, instantly commented on the women. Did any of the women express any thoughts about how their male relatives dress, their brothers or husbands? Oh,
no.
Okay.
No, they didn't. Very straightforward answer. Yeah, they didn't. They just spoke about their sort of relationship to the different garments and what it means and the boundaries they use and yeah. But the men definitely did. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think what you're describing for most migrant communities, I mean, one can kind of try to draw parallels. I'm just interested in your thoughts about language or the loss of language, so as it goes through the generations. So you spoke about Bangla and Sylheti. In the under 30s and younger, is it still common? Is it lost? And from a sociological point of view, what do you interpret from that?
I think there's quite a bit of growing work on this. So if you look at the work of, she actually works at Mariam Centre, East London Mosque, Dr. Mahera Ruby, she's also an academic at Goldsmiths. She found in her research, looking at language maintenance and preservation, that grandparents play a crucial part in maintaining and preservation of the language with the grandchildren, because the parents are speaking to the kids in English. So, and then with her work, Myland Community Project, they did this beautiful set of like vignettes, short videos of grandparents with their grandchildren, and you can watch them all online, and you see the grandmother, she's narrating, you know, I don't know, a simple story, you know, I'm walking down the park and I see a dog playing and running after a ball, and the grandchild is drawing out what the grandmother is saying. So what the video shows is that that grandchild is understanding everything the grandmother is narrating in Sylheti, and the grandchild is drawing out the park and the dog, you know, chasing after a ball and whatnot. So yeah, so grandparents are basically who are there. But then my question is, what happens when the grandparents aren't there? And I think that's when it will definitely become an active loss for the community, because for parents, when I interviewed parents who had adult children, they would say, you know, I work full time, I come home, you know, I don't want to have to think in Sylheti, you know. It's just easier to tell the kids, okay, kids, dinner's ready, kids, do this, get that ready, get your homework done, or get ready for that, you know. So it's also about ease and the constraints of life, I guess, that takes over.
But if you compare, I mean, comparing to maybe or parallels with maybe other communities, I mean, what conclusions do you draw as to the consequences of that? In the sense that if you draw your line, the younger generations will lose that language. So some kind of cultural dilution, something lost.
I mean, for Bengalis, obviously, the language element has always been at the fore with regards to identity. But I think Tower Hamlets, again, is quite exceptional in the sense that when you meet Bengalis from Tower Hamlets, their Sylheti is usually really good. Because, again, going back to the theorizing of the Tower Hamlets being the para or the fara, you know, you're hearing Sylheti everywhere you're going, whether you're getting on the bus, whether you are in Whitechapel Market, whether you are going into the halal meat shop, you know. So Sylheti is audibly in your life pretty regularly, whether it's through your grandparents or not. So I think, you know, and this is where locality matters, right? And you know, so for example, so I teach in Leicester, I teach in Montfort University in the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre, and sometimes when I go around Leicester and I have taught young Asians whose grandparents came from East Africa, they still understand some Swahili, for example. Some of these kids tell me they understand Swahili. And I ask them, where have you learned this to know some of these words? So they don't speak the language, they can't hold a conversation, but if someone is having a conversation, they can pick up the words and say, oh, that's what so-and-so is talking about. So I guess it's around the political will within the community as well, right? Of I want to ensure my child or children of the community speak that language, because I'm assuming maybe some of you do speak Swahili or other languages from, I don't know, Kenya, Tanzania. So I think it boils down to political will. I think I'm just trying to think about, thinking about my own sort of growing up in Luton, where I grew up with a fairly big Azad Kashmiri community who speak Bahari, you know. And again, for that community in Luton, they're hearing it regularly. So I think it's about locality that very much then keeps up your vocabulary, because language is about vocabulary, right? To be able to communicate, you need to know how to say this word, that word. So in the Luton context, I found a lot of young Azad Kashmiris. Thank you very much. Thank you. You know, they're able to maintain the language. So yeah, so I think I'd have to research other localities to give you actual tangible data, but these are just from my observations. But I think there has to be political will within our communities. If we want our community to continue speaking Urdu or, I don't know, Sindhi or Kutchi or whatever, then you've got to maintain that, right? Not just rely on the grandparents, because the grandparents, when they leave, you know, so yeah.
Any last questions? Thank you very much, Dr. Fatima.
Thank you so much for having
please,
me. Thank you.
give her another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you.
Tomorrow we'll be celebrating the wiladat of Bibi Fatima Zahra. The program will begin at 4:05 p.m. with Salah, followed by dinner, and in the main program with a talk by Dr. Imran Ali Panjwani. Brothers and sisters, we also have activities throughout the week, including Mums and Tots and Ladies Pilates on Mondays, yoga and ladies exercise classes on Tuesdays, karate and taekwondo on Wednesdays, hifth classes and dua kumal on Thursdays, our salam talks on Fridays, women's walking club on Saturday mornings, and tuition on Saturday afternoons, and tafsir and soul kitchen on Sundays. Please do join us throughout the week. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.